Now, detox is a topic that is very intriguing, very interesting to a lot of people, because I think there's a general awareness in society that we're bombarded with toxins of all different descriptions. And our bodies somehow have to cope with those, and we have to eliminate them, but ideally we don't get them in. But if we do get them in, we've got to somehow cope with them, because otherwise what happens? Our body starts to struggle if the toxic load is too much. But before we get too much into the toxins, I just want to review something here, and that is that we've got the whole slide that we do every time. This is, of course, the third part in our series. We just remind ourselves what health is. Now, health is not just the physical, although we do emphasise the physical a lot, but there's also the mental, the emotional, the social and the spiritual. And we've actually spent a lot of time talking about each of these in the first two sessions. And so now we get into detox. But before then, I want to do a quick review, because some people may have missed last night, about this study that we mentioned, the veteran study, because this was a study that had lots of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and they looked at 8 lifestyle factors that actually made a key difference in people's lives and longevity. In fact, if someone did all 8 habits compared to 0 habits, because they identified 8 key habits that made a difference to how long we live, then there was a difference of, does anyone remember if you started those at age 40, what the difference in life expectancy would be? Yeah, 24 years. Amazing, 24 years. But even if you start at 50 or 60 or 70 or 80, you can get benefits no matter what age you start at. Well, this study actually went to 99 years of age. So I don't know, anyone here who's 99 or above? Well, you know what, then the studies apply exactly to you. But even if you're over 100, I think there's a pretty good chance that by following these, it's still going to do you a lot of benefit. Now, this was a graph that actually showed that each additional habit would add years to life. This is if someone started at 40. So if you did one of them, that was good. If you did all 8, each one up until the maximum of 8 added extra years to your life expectancy. Now, we also noted, and this is what I just said, that this is how many years extra, this is the age that you're at, but even if you're 90, even if you're 95, it's still going to, on average, add years to your life. Now, of course, what are the habits? Well, just to quickly run through them again, we spoke about nutrition, about physical activity, about restorative sleep. Now, that's a good one. Now, don't you like that word restorative, as opposed to just sleep? Then we also had the never smoking. We made some comments about that, the no excessive alcohol consumption. Although what we did have a look at, there was a study from, do you remember how recent the study was? July 2026. Now, is that recent or what? So if anyone's watching this afterwards, July 2026 is actually when we're here today live. So it's a study that's just come out. And what it showed was that actually what we thought was a safe drinking level is no longer considered to be safe, because even the health risks there. And so, look, government departments now, the World Health Organization, are saying there is actually no safe level, that the risk increases from the start. Now, then we have the next one, which was no opioid use disorder. Now, that one is a big one because, look, it was a veteran population, those who had served in the armed forces. So it was possibly more of an issue than with the general population. Then we looked at the next one, which was, do you remember which one it was? It was a social connection. And then there was actually the stress management as well. So look, that will catch up with us in due course. I know everyone's ready with their cameras, ready when the next two come up. We've got social connections and stress management. So these are the 8. This is a chance, before I go on to the next slide, because I know what it's like. I've been to seminars as well where, the people drop down with the slide and you're there wanting to take a photo and you just don't know when the last point's going to be. And so you end up taking about 4 slides of the one thing, thinking, oh, maybe that's the last point. No, that's the last point. So it just brought back those memories when I just saw people taking a photo of it. All right. So stress management. So these are the 8 habits or 8 lifestyle issues that were studied in this. Now, it doesn't mean there's only 8 in total and there's nothing else that can help. As we saw this morning, even something you would think, you don't even give it much thought, but regular church attendance, on a weekly basis, adds, up to 7 years extra in life expectancy. And there's so many other lifestyle things. So if we do these things well, and we do them often, the expected average additional life expectancy can be quite significant. Well, what I want to do now is talk about toxicity. Now, if we go back to the previous slide, you notice that 3 of them actually did effectively deal with toxicity: the smoking, the alcohol, and the opioid use disorder. So toxins are... Oh, which one? Yes. No, well, I think you're right. Now, I'm going to make a comment there. You could almost argue that each one of them has a toxic element. And I think, look, it's a well-made point, but I would broaden it, because nutrition, and we're going to come to that a little bit, there is certainly stuff that we eat that's no good for us, that's toxic. Same, physical activity. Well, I guess there can be types of physical activity which may be done incorrectly, or they might damage you as well. When we look at sleep, well, look, I guess restorative sleep, just by its very nature, is saying that it's good. So, look, maybe that one not so much. But look, in terms of social connections, we can have toxic social connections. And we don't want those, because that's not going to be beneficial, it's going to be counterproductive. Same with stress management. Well, if we manage it well, but if we don't manage it well, we're going to have a problem. So, no, well, thank you. Look, I think you make a good point there. But I'm going to deal now with toxicity. Now, I don't know, that's not particularly a peaceful scene, is it? It's, you look at that and you think, no, it doesn't necessarily bring positive emotions. Now, but toxins are a big thing, because when we look at exposure, there are tens of thousands of new chemicals which are being produced every year that we're exposed to, most of which have never been tested in human populations. So industry will produce these. The good news is at least we have, and I would argue we have a system, a detox system that has been designed, and I use that word intentionally, it's been designed to cope with all these different, or the vast majority of these new chemicals that the body might not have ever seen before. But we have a detox system. So what happens if there's something, well, first of all, things go into, it might be digestion, it might be we breathe them in, it might be absorbed through the skin, but then our body has to deal with them. How does it deal with them? Well, we have our liver, right? We have the liver is one of the major organs of detoxification. And then it's excreted through the bile, and then we eliminate through our bowels. The kidneys are very important, where we detox. Our breathing, we can breathe the toxins out. We can sweat toxins out through our skin. So these are just some of the pathways we can eliminate. Actually, even, it's interesting, when we grow our hair, it's one of the mechanisms where toxins can actually go in our hair, and we can excrete them through our hair when it grows. There's some people actually even do analysis of hair to try to find different toxicities. And so there's no question that we're exposed to many different chemicals. And as we mentioned last night, the cell, in terms of the physical sense, is the basic building block of our bodies. So we have, does anyone know how many cells we have, our bodies are made up typically? It's a tough question. It's about 10 trillion is the figure which is quoted. And look, they've got to function well. If they function well, we have healthy bodies. If they don't function well, we're likely to have disease. Now, one of the things I mentioned yesterday is that the cell is very basic in terms of its function. We need the good nutrients. We need to feed it well with the right nutrients. It can be things like, proteins and essential fats and the good carbohydrates, etc. But also we need vitamins and minerals and a lot of other things. So we need good quality things that go into the cell. On the other hand, we want to stop the toxins going into the cell. Now, why do we want to do that? Because the toxins stop the cells from working properly. See, if the cell doesn't work properly, then our organ systems don't work properly, things break down sooner, and we get diseases much more easily. But of course, the other thing, as a natural consequence of our cell working, in terms of our metabolism, we produce waste products. Just like, if you've got a car, you can feed petrol into it, it can go, but there's exhaust that comes out. It's the same. Our cell, as part of its natural working, will produce waste products that we need to excrete. And so they come out of the cell and it goes into the circulation or through the lymph, and we have processes where we get rid of them out of our body. And so we want all of those systems to work. So the issue here is we need all three. We want good nutrition, because if we had good nutrition, actually it can deal with the toxicity much better. But we want to eliminate the toxins, because if we have too many toxins, it's going to make the cells not work. And waste products, we want to be able to get rid of them efficiently and get them out the way. Otherwise, they're going to back up in terms of the works, and they're going to gum up the works, and our cells aren't going to work. And so that contributes towards disease. So this is why the cell is very important when we look at this topic of toxicity. Now, the role of the liver. Now, I did mention there are several organs that are very important in the detox process, but the liver takes a very important and some would argue central role. Because as the blood goes through there, the liver in many ways is a filter. It actually filters out, and we have chemical processes by which a lot of those various toxins are actually captured, and then they go through two phases. The first phase converts the toxins into an intermediary state, and then we have a phase 2 which goes in there and there's a third that actually makes them in a form that they can be excreted quite easily through the bile. So if you see the diagram here, well, you've got the liver, and you can see the gallbladder there, and so the gallbladder, it has bile in there that concentrates, and then when there's a fatty meal, well, that comes through and it all drains out into the intestine and then is eliminated. So what we need to do is to make sure our livers are healthy. We want to make sure we've got good bile flow, but we also want to make sure our bowels are working well, because we want to get the stuff out. See, there is a problem with the bowel. It's not a problem if things are working well. The thing is that we can go through all the effort of getting the toxins into the liver, out of the liver, down the bile, into the intestine, and if we're not careful, up to 90% of those toxins can be reabsorbed and go back into the body at the end, towards the end of the colon. That's not very good, is it? This is why, for example, this is one reason why you want to have a good bowel function. You want it to flow well, because you want to eliminate those toxins, not have them sitting there for days at a time and reabsorbing the stuff that we don't want. So we want to have good bowel habit. So this is where things like plenty of fibre, and just making sure it's regular. And drinking enough water, all that stuff is very important, because we want all these systems working and moving well. Now, we can talk a lot about toxins, but what are some of the common toxins? Now, look, there's already 3 that we've already mentioned, haven't we, as part of the 8. There was the smoking, or the smoking, alcohol, and opioids. Okay, so we can broaden opioids to say, well, we'll say illicit, or sometimes even prescribed drugs. Sometimes they can actually be a problem. So I think they're the first 3 which I've got on the list. Yeah, alcohol, cigarette smoke, and drugs. Now, of course, sometimes drugs, and particularly pharmaceutical drugs, can be very important for our health, and so. We need to make sure that we follow the advice of our health professionals. But, there are various drugs, and sometimes there is stuff that we can take that interacts with other things, and it can cause problems, and it can be toxic. Now, besides those first 3, may be interesting if, some of the group here, what are some of the other toxins that we can think of that, that can affect us? All right, we've got... Okay, pollution. Now here, that's a good one. We can actually break that down into different types of pollution. One could be air pollution. There could be electromagnetic fields. Sometimes, you could say pollution in terms of the environment. Pollution is a really important one. So that's good. Yeah.
What about pesticides?
Yeah. So that's another one, and that's a big one. Pesticides is fascinating. And I think more and more we're finding the neurological effect. Well, not just neurological. We also know that it has a major impact on the gut microbiome. How yesterday I was talking about good and bad bacteria. Well, the point is that the pesticides can actually impact. Well, think about it. They're supposed to kill, certain living bugs, right? So the point is they can have an effect. Even if they say they're safe for humans, the point is we've got more. We've got 10 trillion cells. We've got more than 10 trillion microbes in us, and the pesticides can actually affect them adversely because we want good bacteria and we want bad ones, good microbiome. And that's interesting. In fact, I'll give you the story. The first ever resident I looked after in aged care was a guy who was he came in, he was admitted, he was in the dementia ward, and physically fit as a bull, except his mind, his memory had gone. And the only thing, no one could come up with a reason why. Look, he was no particular diagnosis, but as I delved a bit into history, I found out that the guy, he was a greenkeeper on a golf course for 40 years and had been spraying the golf greens for the last 40 years. It's the only thing that we could find as to any reason. Now, look, I can't prove 100% that that's the reason, but the point is, to me, that's a very suspicious association. So, look, you do mention pesticides, and I think, look, it's one of those things that if we can somehow reduce our exposure to those, it's good. Look, I know people who, and I guess we don't do it so much now, but the old timers, right? They would have their, acreage farms and all the rest, and they would go out there and they'd spray all the stuff, right, with the Roundup. But, they were tough in those days, to be shorts and, all the rest, and forget the protective gear, and, they're breathing it in, it was all over their skin. Well, the problem we know now that, look, that can lead to problems down the track. So, look, if anyone is using this stuff, make sure that you wear all the proper equipment and don't breathe it in and have it on your skin.
What I found out is if I use vinegar to kill the weeds around our house.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So what you're saying is there's other ways that you can do it, because no one wants the pests, eating their crops. But if there's something that is less toxic, of course, we want to consider it. So appreciate that. All right, now, another one. Yeah, up the back. Poor food handling. Yeah. So this is the point. Toxins in terms of contamination, food contamination. And that's something that we've always got to do that. Now, I know when you guys put on a lunch, I would imagine that, there's very strict protocols that you would follow in food handling, which is good. Now, any restaurant is supposed to do that. Hospitality, there's various rules that we must follow for proper food handling, because otherwise we can get all sorts of gastric upsets and diseases and all the rest, and we don't want that. And there are public health outbreaks of exactly this, if there's a breakdown in that handling. So thank you, that's an important one. Any other toxins, common toxins that we can think of? All right, we've got one here.
In your household products, your shampoo, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, personal care products. Yeah, that's one we often don't think about, but it is important. Because I'll come to you in a moment. No, I've still noted, but personal care products, we absorb so much through our skin. Now, when we think about it, look, what's one of the common pain medications that we have in aged care? When people have chronic pain and they don't want to swallow a tablet all the time, one of the things is the pain patch. You might know people, they put a pain patch. What's that? Well, it's absorbed through the skin. There's various medications that are what absorb through the skin. So when we put some chemical, now I'll just say broadly personal care product, well, you know what? Chances are there's going to be some component or various components of that are going to be absorbed through the skin. Now, some things, of course, are going to be beneficial to us. But sometimes when you look at these labels and you try to read what's on there, you wonder, what is that? Well, maybe your body sometimes wonder, what is that? The point is, it has to then process it and detoxify it. See, the thing is, there's a thing called sort of a toxic load threshold. And so there are some practitioners talk about this, that your body can cope up until a certain level, and you can then eliminate, so your liver can function a certain way, your kidneys will do a certain amount. But if you've got all these different toxins coming from all these different areas, there comes a time where you might reach a threshold and your body can't cope with the amount of toxicity. It may be that there might be not one individual one that actually does the ultimate damage, but it could be everything combined together could be enough that combined they tip you over the edge, in which case then your body then doesn't cope so well, so the liver starts to struggle a bit, the kidneys start developing some damage, and so the toxicity in your body rises, and then it can cause a whole lot of downstream effects. So things don't work so well, or you might get some inflammation, or you start developing various symptoms. And so this is why, now personal care products in and of themselves may be not enough to make you sick, but the point is if that's there together with something else, you might get a combined threshold. So this is why ultimately we want to reduce the various toxicities, because then we get below that threshold and we actually can cope much better. Our bodies can cope with that. Now, we had another one up the back. Spouses, wow. I think, that's a good one. I think that can go, how we had the list of 8 and we had the positive side of things and we had maybe the negative side of things. Well, spouses, in the ideal world, spouses are fabulous. Everything works well, you work together as a team and there's a wonderful connection and relationship. But, look, I think you're right, sometimes things don't work. But we're actually going to come to it because there is a toxicity which is negative emotions, and also there can be stress that comes from relationships that maybe aren't working so well. So, look, ideally we actually do want to manage those things and see what we can to improve or address those issues, because you make an excellent point that there can be these other relationships and other connections we have, and if it turns toxic, it actually can be very destructive. So, look, thank you for that. Another one. Sorry?
Along those lines, the sun.
Okay, the sun. Yeah, isn't that interesting? The sun, now that's a double-edged one as well. Because sunshine, on the one hand, can be good, on the other hand, bad. See, for the last 50 years we've been told that to avoid the sun because, and we don't, look, quite rightly, we need to be aware of things like, well, particularly skin cancers, right? Accelerated ageing if we have too much sun, okay? So we want to avoid those things. But on the other hand, there are some good things in sunshine. We know vitamin D, and a lot of people, you'd be surprised how many people in aged care are low in vitamin D. It's almost, if they're not deficient when they arrive there, they're deficient 6 months later because none of them see the sun, right? So, I test that often in aged care, and I find that almost everybody ends up being on a vitamin D supplement. It just happens. So vitamin D, but vitamin D is important for so many things, immune system, for, in terms of, even our brain and health, and look, the vitamin D. Yeah, mood, absolutely. Mood, so, vitamin D, so important. And so this is the problem. So what are some of the other things sunshine is good for? Because we touched on it very briefly last night. Do you remember some of the things that sunshine can do? Yeah, well, mental health. And so, look, it helps us to set the body clock as well. So it will then, in turn, help us have the 24-hour circadian rhythm. It will help us with our sleep as well. The other one, which is only more recently being talked about, is that the sun actually is a source of cellular energy. It can actually provide energy to the cells through the cytochrome C pathway, and there are certain wavelengths which will do that. And of course the sunshine is broad spectrum in its wavelength too. So this is why sometimes people will feel a bit more energised after they've been out in the sun, because there's a good reason for it. But this is the problem. It's double-edged, because we don't want to spend too much time in the sun, because then we can do damage to our skin and we can contribute towards the risk of developing skin cancers. So anyway, that's an interesting one. Look, hang on, we've got a couple of other hands. I think I saw, no, we've got, was there one there? Terry, where am I? No, okay. All right, no, Terry. Okay, up the back. Sorry, which one? Oh, the sun acts as a disinfectant. Yeah, well, that's interesting. I've done that with some of my residents in aged care who develop chronic wounds, right? Who have I've sometimes it's sometimes difficult, but I say, well, hang on. What you want to do is to get out, and you don't want to get them sunburn, obviously, but even if a few minutes out in the sun, open up the wound, get some sunshine on it, and you know what? You want the thing. If you can have, because what's a scab do? If you've got a dried scab on top of a wound, you know what? You can have the healing underneath. If it's all moist and wet and all goopy, you know what? It can fester on itself. So we've got to be careful there. But this is where a little bit of sunshine on a wound, without obviously burning it, we don't want to do that, can actually be quite healthy. And it gives you that cellular energy, it gives you that vitamin D, it can help with the healing. In fact, the other thing which I found quite useful, and there's quite a number of studies I'm finding coming out on this, it wasn't talked about even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm finding that if I've got a patient who has chronic wounds, that are getting infected all the time, not healing, I usually test them for zinc. I find that almost all of them are low in zinc. And so I supplement them with zinc and also give them vitamin C as well. Because we know vitamin C is very important for healing and for collagen production. Similar zinc, very important for the immune system, very important for skin health. What we find in aged care, unfortunately, it's not just aged care. I think, a lot of people in the general community find that, we're low. I test a lot of people for zinc, have done over the years. They tend to be on the low end of normal or frankly deficient. You give them zinc, they won't. I had a lady, she only recently passed away at the age of 99, but when she was 93, she first came to the aged care home, and she was getting infections continuously, and she was on course after course of antibiotics, and it was a mess. I tested her zinc levels. Normal is between 10 and 25, although I think 10 is still too low for my liking. But hers came back at about 6. And so it was frankly deficient. So we supplemented her with a good dose, put her on the vitamin C. Within a month or two, they had resolved and she almost never got another infection again, which was, it was just one example. Now, not that I want to labour on that, but it's an interesting example that I've seen in the aged care setting. So, a disinfectant. Sorry, that all started from the disinfectant, didn't it? All right, now we had it again. No, there was, okay, one other one, or we'll continue on. You've covered a lot of good toxins. There's a few. Look, I'll mention a few others. Well, look, air pollution has been mentioned. Now, this is it. We don't think, now you might think that you don't have any air pollution in Hervey Bay, and outside you probably don't. But what about indoors? I know, indoors. That's the point, because we can buy, that's right, new furnitures and stuff can off-gas. You can have, volatile, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and new cars, right? The new cars, some people think it's a beautiful smell, but the point is, look, there's some stuff there. Also, the quality of our air. If all the windows are shut and, let's say it's either too hot or cold outside, you shut all the windows and, you can have stale air. And some of the different stuff off-gassing, and that can be a problem. The other, so what do you do about that? Well, okay, you want fresh air for starters, but this is where indoor plants can be quite useful too, because they can actually really freshen it up. They're crazy things, they can absorb the toxins. Well, and if it's too toxic, I guess then you get a new plant, right? But much better the plant than you. So, so air pollution is something that, you're not somehow, absolved of that just because you live in a beautiful part of the world. So just be aware of that. The next one, heavy metals. We think of things like, mercury and lead and, cadmium and, aluminium and, there's a whole range of them. Now, the problem is that we can ingest them and they get into our bodies and, sometimes they're very difficult to get out. And so the problem is, over a lifetime, we accumulate a lot of them. And we can, so we need to be very careful. That's just one example where we want to stop any more coming in if we can, but look, if we can eliminate them, even better. Look, can anyone think of some common causes of heavy metals? Mercury fillings, yes, someone said. Yeah, another one? Yeah, okay, yeah. So aluminium in terms of cooking and stuff. So some people will say, well, don't use aluminium pots and pans. Use stainless steel or ceramic or something. Yeah. Okay, any other heavy metal sources? Yep. Paint? Yeah. Well, look, in the old days there was a lot of lead in paint. Now, look, they've taken it out of. But if you've got an older building, that can be a major problem. Well, yeah, asbestos. So much. Look, I guess I wouldn't put it. It's certainly in the toxic class. Absolutely. So asbestos, we've got to be very careful in the handling of it, particularly if we're grinding it, cutting it, we breathe it in. It can a lot of lung problems, increased risk of. So a lot of these. Yeah. Okay, another one. Yeah, fluoride. Okay, yeah. Fluoride probably wouldn't quite put in the heavy, but still, yeah, toxicity. But yeah, copper. Copper can be a problem. We need some copper, but too much copper is a problem. In fact, that's interesting because zinc and copper are antagonists. And one of the ways that you can, if you've got too much copper, then having additional zinc can actually help to balance the copper. And this is a problem. Sometimes we can accumulate copper. While not officially heavy metal, because it does have a medical use, it has a biochemical use, obviously too much of it can be a problem. And some people do have too much copper. So that's a whole big area because there's been work done on, say, copper toxicity and mental health issues as well. So if anyone, if you're interested in that, delve into that. But you'll find a lot of stuff online on that particular topic. Okay, so there's a lot we can do. Look, another one is that we've got to be careful with particularly fish, which is bigger fish, because they do the little ones and it accumulates up the chain. And so mercury and cadmium particularly. In fact, there's health warnings for women who are pregnant who have to be very careful with some of the fish that will have too much of the mercury or the cadmium. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, the point is, I guess they can come in from all sorts of countries. So we can get them obviously in this country, but look, anything can be manufactured in any country and have some of these toxicities. No, you're quite right. I want to just touch on very briefly. It was mentioned about the mercury fillings. Now that's been highly controversial. When I first started out in medicine, anyone who said anything against mercury fillings, it was that was kind of out there. But what's happened since that time? Mercury fillings have been banned in many of the European countries now. I think even for the first time in the United States, there's some questioning over it, whereas they were highly supportive of it. And same, look, I remember talking with some dentists a decade ago, some of my friends who were dentists, and they were saying, no, it's perfectly safe. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, I'm not sure it is. And I started finding the peer-reviewed literature that was talking about increased risk of, Alzheimer's disease and a whole bunch of other effects of, mercury fillings. So, This is the point. What we do know is that mercury fillings will leach very, very slowly to the rate of, it's approximately 5, it can be up to 20, but about 5 micrograms a day. And so what can happen? Now the point is, for most people, your detox systems can deal with it, can cope with it reasonably well. But what if you have multiple fillings? And what happens if you have multiple other toxicities happening at the same time? It can contribute towards you getting towards a threshold much sooner. And that's an issue. So some people say, well, look, no, I've had mercury fillings, I'm perfectly fine. And the point is that your body may be able to cope with it quite adequately. But there's some people who will come to the stage where they may not be able to cope with it adequately. Look, I remember one patient came to me when I was in clinic. She would have been in her mid-30s. And she wasn't even my patient. I was there. The other doctors said, oh, look, I need to go home early. Look, I've got one patient left this afternoon. Can you see her? Look, don't worry, there's nothing. She's had all these test results. They've come back normal. Just let her know it's normal and that's fine. Well, sure enough, I said, okay, fine. So she came in and she looked, I've got to say, as soon as she walked in, she looked looked barely alive. She was grey. She was ghastly grey. She had no energy. She was 35, but she looked 55. There was something obviously very wrong. Well, and what were the results she had? She'd had CAT scans. She's had a CAT scan of her neck, of her chest, of her abdomen, of her pelvis. Well, you don't get those tests because, you're just coming in for your annual checkup. So I've got some history. What's going on? Well, it turned out that she'd lost something like almost 20 kilograms in the last 5 months. She'd been investigated in the hospital because they thought she must have had a cancer somewhere, but they weren't sure where. No one could find out what was wrong with her. So I wasn't too sure either. I didn't know her that well. So I thought, well, there's obviously something going on. And look, amongst other things, she had headaches, she had no energy, etc. So look, the one part that hadn't actually been scanned was her head. I thought, well, we better check her head, make sure she doesn't have a brain tumour. All right, so we did that. And then she came back, gave me a little bit of time to think, well, what else can we do for her? So then I started questioning her about a whole range of different potential exposures, including toxic exposures. And I said, well, look, have you had or have you ever had fillings, mercury fillings? Oh, she said, yeah. She said, yeah, actually, I got one put in years ago, but look, 5 months ago, I chipped my tooth. And it's just there, sort of hanging off. It's, it hasn't gone, but it's still there. So I said, well, show me. I had a look, broken tooth with this exposed mercury filling. Thinking, well, I said, well, look, my recommendation is that you actually get that taken out, but you need to do it properly, okay? So there's certain practitioners who will do it. You've got to do it with a proper procedure because you don't want to then absorb it or by accident swallow it. So it's got to be done properly, right? So she went, so 2 weeks later she comes back. And she comes in, and look, this rarely happens in practice, but she turned up at the door with a bunch of flowers. And she was dressed like she was in colour now. She wasn't in blacked out, ghastly grey, black and white. And she had this energy, and she bounced in within a spring, in a step. And she said, wow, look, you wouldn't believe it. I went and got these taken out, and within 24 hours... I was a different person. My appetite came back. I wanted to eat for the first time. I felt better. My energy was there. My husband didn't know who I was. I wasn't suddenly grumpy and irritable. I was actually nice to him. And all these things. And so she was a totally transformed person because of... Now, in that case, it's not typical. Someone who's got amalgam that's just sitting there, maybe slowly leaking, your body can cope with it. But in her case, because she had chipped the tooth... Now, I'm really quite sad we hadn't checked the mercury levels at that stage. I think it would have been really interesting. But, look, clearly mercury was having a massive effect on her, and once we were able to address the root cause of that, something massive happened and she got a totally different life to what she had. I mean, she thought she was going to be an invalid for the rest of her life. That's how despairing she was. Anyway, so we could talk a lot about heavy metals, but I need to continue on because... Just like, you probably gathered, I like to talk about some of these things, then we run out of time. But anyway, plastics. Now, that's a big one, plastics. Now, we don't really think about plastics much, except for, did you know that you have got these things called microplastics? So look, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but look, I tend to use a glass bottle now as opposed to a plastic bottle. They're stainless steel, which is good as well. But also, look, in cookware and all those things, look, if we can reduce our plastic exposure, it's good because there are things called microplastics and they get absorbed into the body and your body has to somehow address them. Now, the negative is, these can have disruptive effects, and they are what are called endocrine disruptors. So our hormonal systems can be put out of whack to either a lesser and sometimes even greater degree if we've accumulated a lot of the microplastics in there. And so what we want to do is at least, now our body, I guess in time, has its own detoxification systems, but we want to, if possible, to eliminate as much as possible more of these coming in. Because we know that endocrine problems are a big problem, and what we're recognising more and more is that microplastics can be a contributor to it as well. And when you say hormonal stuff, I mean this can be, male and female, male hormones as well. It can be anything, from testosterone, estrogen. Look, there are different disruptors. They're called endocrine disruptors. So plastics, all right. Another one is, okay, the next one is, it'll come up in a moment. There it goes, mould. Mould. Oh, I can see some knowing glances and knowing nods when people are talking there. Look, that's a big one. I'll tell you first-hand experience on that one. We're going back probably about 15 years. we were renting a place. And the owner, when we moved in, the owner said, look, now I know there's a problem with the roof. Don't worry, I'm going to get round and fix it. Well, the problem was, it was about 15 years ago, I don't know whether it was here, there was one year where it rained the entire summer, and it was big rain. And so it got so bad that the gutters overflowed, the whole roof flooded, there was water actually pouring down the walls. And then, you guessed it, a few days later, all this black stuff, the whole wall was covered with black mould. Now, the thing is that we started feeling unwell with it. Well, because there's all these toxic effects of mould, right? So anything from respiratory system to brain fog to worse. But look, it got so bad for me. Look, I was reversing out, and I backed into our other car because seriously, I don't know. It's probably worse than having, I don't know how many glasses of alcohol would it take to get that foggy. I don't know, but. Anyway, it was just really bad. We had to move out. In fact, it was so bad, there was a mushroom started growing in the tiles in the kitchen. So we got there and wondered, what is this? Seriously, there's a mushroom growing. That was how wet it was. And so, look, the landlord, in the end, we just had to move out. We moved out for a month. It was all fixed, seemingly, but it was never the same. Why? Because... okay, the visible stuff, but what's behind the kitchen cabinets? What's behind, what's all the places you can't see? And we found that we didn't really recover. We had to move out. Now, there was another instance. I had a patient. She was a university student. Now, she had all sorts of headaches, fatigue. In fact, she could not concentrate on university studies, and they were suffering very badly. Now, she had been to some other doctors. There was nothing obvious. All the blood tests came back normal. Look, I did some testing on her, everything normal. I referred her to a physician specialist. Look, there's something going on here. We don't know what's going on. She went there, had a lot of other tests done, nothing found. Problem still happening. So she came back, and so I started delving a bit more into, look, tell me about the place where you live. Is there any mould, for example? She was in the basement, renting for someone, and she said, the whole place is full of mould. The bathroom's got mould, but I'm in the basement and the walls have got mould. There's mould everywhere. I said, well, look, you're going to either have to have to be fixed up properly, or you're going to have to think about moving out. And she said, well, I can't afford to move out. The rent's very affordable. I can't go anywhere else. Well, I said, well, look, it's your health. So she persisted. In the end, it was so bad she had to move out. And when she moved out, sure enough, the thing was that she recovered and she successfully completed studies, and she felt completely well again. So mould exposures can be a problem, so just be aware of it. It's a toxicity that can actually make a big difference in someone's life. Okay, we need to continue on because there's so much, and I'm sure you guys, but looking at the knowing glances, there's probably half a dozen stories you guys have about mould as well, and I'm seeing the heads nodding as well. Pesticides. We've covered pesticides, so we won't need to go too much more into that. Toxic food. Oh boy. Well, we know about trans fats for starters, don't we? Now, do you know what actually the problem with the trans fats is? Look, one way of describing it is this. You know that fats, in part, are important for the structure of our cells, and particularly for membranes in cells and all the rest. Now, the problem with trans fats is they've got very similar composition to the ordinary fats would use, but they've got a slightly different configuration. So your body doesn't distinguish really well between the trans fats and the normal ones that you're supposed to actually use. So the trans fats go in there, and your body tries to put them in the membranes and other places, but they're the wrong shape. And so they basically, for want of a better term, they gum up the works, and it just makes your body not function properly, and so the membranes don't work properly. So this is why trans fats can be a real problem. So we don't want those. And so, that's why at least, look, I've got to say I'm very happy the health authorities have now said we've got a limit, and packaging has to say, and you've got to be below a certain limit. And I think that's absolutely spot on. We don't want those. But what are the other things? Now, look, of course we've touched on poor, food handling methods. That would be toxic food. But what about even something like, is sugar toxic? Oh, see, it certainly is in excess. Now, maybe the tiniest little bit, it's okay, but what does sugar, so processed, yeah, the sugar, what contributes towards inflammation? Inflammation is the common pathway to just about every chronic disease. So if we have too much sugar, our body then has to somehow cope with it. Now, too much sugar then, also our body wants to store it. Well, it has to do something with it, and it gets stored as fat, doesn't it? So we might think we're having, the sugar, and we're not having fat, but it actually ends up as fat, a lot of it. It also affects our immune system. I remember reading a study many years ago where they had, I guess they were volunteers, maybe they got lots of volunteers for this one, I don't know, but they were given 25 teaspoons of sugar. Now that's, I looked it up, probably the closest equivalent we have would be one of the most famous fast food places, one of their big upsized thick shakes, right? That would probably be the closest equivalent we have. So, 25 teaspoons of sugar. I don't know, look, most of us would not cope with it, but young people sometimes love it. Look, I've got to say, when I was growing up, I didn't mind the odd thick shake either, but these days, no, of course, I know better. Now, with what they found was that they actually looked at people's white cells. You know how the white cells are our immune cells, right? They fight against infection. And so they looked at the activity of immune cells and whether they would do the job. So if you got exposed to a virus, how useful your white cells were going to be. So they found that with 25 teaspoons of sugar, it reduced the effectiveness of your white cells by over 90% for a period of at least 6 hours. Wow, so that's the point. So, you can be having all this sugar and thinking, fantastic, this tastes yummy, but you know what? You have this virus come along and you know what? You're sitting duck. It's likely that you're going to be exposed. See, this is the point. When it comes to viral illnesses, have you ever wondered why some people catch everything and some people seem to catch not much at all? Well, it's not the fact that the virus itself may be better or worse or more virulent. It could be that maybe the person has an immune system and a general health and a general nutrition and lifestyle, we call it the terrain, where that if they get exposed to something, their body can deal with it, whereas there might be someone else who maybe doesn't have the same, let's say, terrain or lifestyle habits, so it means that they're much more likely to be susceptible. So, and there were studies along these lines as well that came out, even just in recent years, in terms of the lifestyle and impact of it on infectious diseases. And so, look, this is where if we eat, be it sugars or there's other foods, if our cells are not healthy, we can have a problem with this. So, toxic food can be a problem. All right, sugar. Look at that. I even had sugar in its own category. We've already addressed that one. What about negative emotions? Absolutely. So, it's not surprising with some of the stuff that we spoke about in terms of epigenetics and the impact that can have. So our thoughts, our emotions can deal with how we respond to situations. Chronic stress, we spoke about stress yesterday. These are things which actually can dampen down our immune responses and also contribute to accelerated ageing and also increased health problems. Now, what I will say here, there was, and this is, what I've been saying is not somehow that is now, it took some years ago, people thought, okay, well, look, medical doctor, what are you talking about this stuff for? But these days, it's actually very much in the mainstream. This is a textbook published by Elsevier, one of the major mainstream publishers of textbooks. This book came out some years ago, Clinical Environmental Medicine. And I've actually heard the guy, Pizzorno, fascinating lecturing on this stuff. But this is from the table of contents, and it may be a little bit small, but this is from, and look what it looks like. I mean, okay, it's got an introduction to environmental medicine, so it's got here the science of it, then oxidative damage and inflammation, food pollution, water pollution, indoor air pollution, outdoor air pollution, health and beauty products and drugs. Okay, that's a start. But look at the toxicants, metals. Arsenic, cadmium, you've got hexavalent chromium, cobalt, lead, mercury, other metals. Then you've got inorganic chemicals, fluoride. Now that's an interesting one, fluoride. Solvents, benzene, toluene, etc. Pesticides, a whole group. Herbicides. Now, glyphosate's a fascinating one, which is still commonly used. Plasticizers, like bisphenol A, phthalates, other persistents, preservatives, airborne. So mould, we've got mould, water damage, building toxicity, ozone, particulate matter, and then we've got endotoxicity, and then toxins of choice, they have it. So things like alcohol, marijuana, high fructose corn syrup. Now that's a fascinating one, isn't it? Salt, smoking, wheat. Now even wheat, for some people, wheat can actually be a real problem. It's one of the most common sensitivities that people have. And so then he goes through systemic toxic effects and so on, and the different organ systems. There's a whole other page, and then his whole section on things that can be done. So what I'm saying is the things that we're talking about are actually getting increased recognition in terms of mainstream medicine, in terms of mainstream science, and there we have an example of a mainstream textbook that actually addresses these issues. So fascinating. Now, so what are the things? Now we've got only a little bit of time left. So in the last few minutes that we have, what are some of the things that we can do to detox and to have stronger defences? Well, the funny thing is we've already covered a lot of them. And this is what I like about lifestyle medicine and looking at this big picture sort of thing, is the same principles come over again and again. It's not as if we have to learn a brand new list for every brand new problem. Now, sure, there might be some fine nuances. There might be, a couple of things that are specific. But when we look at the major lifestyle diseases, you know what? The principles are largely the same. Okay. So I want to decrease toxin exposure. Well, we've made several comments about that, but look, by knowing the source or the type of toxins, well, we can have a think about what we can do in terms of our daily living that we can reduce the exposure to those things. And recognising that, we don't have to somehow be perfect in every one of those areas at the start, but even changes we can make in 2 or 3 of them initially are going to decrease our toxic load burden, aren't they? Now, the next one is eat nutritious food. Well, we've covered that last night. Now, we want to have predominantly what we want to do, plant-based, not processed. We want to have a wide variety of, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, all those things in as natural form as possible. And we want to not have the toxic food. I mean, we want to have nutrition-dense food, not just calorie-dense food, certainly not junk food or toxic food. Activity exercise, we've spoken about that as well. The Australian guidelines, 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise a week. Now, 80% of the population in Australia don't reach that. In fact, I'm surprised that 20% do. But maybe that's more of the surprise, but I guess, anyway, but that's something that we want to strive to do. Drink clean water. Now, we spoke a bit about water, the necessity of water, the importance of it, but you know what, sometimes we want to just make sure that the quality of water is there. Now, if you're unsure about the quality, get yourself a good water filter, a purifier, because it's so important to make sure that you have quality drinking water, because you want to drink good amounts of it, and because the water itself is what cleansing, isn't it? Because the water because if you're dehydrated, your kidneys are struggling. They still want to try to get rid of the toxins, but they're straining them. You have plenty of water, then things actually eliminate much more easily. It also helps the bowels actually to work much better as well if you're not dehydrated. These things are important. Now, what about sleep? Sleep is really important. Now, who here has heard of the glymphatic system? Okay, we've got an opportunity that many people can learn about the glymphatic system. Now, you've heard of the lymphatic system, right? Now, that's one of the ways that we drain. It's fluid which drains through, and it can get rid of toxins. That's wonderful. Now, did you know that there's a system in the brain that does a detox as well? There are channels in your brain, between your brain cells, which have been called the glymphatic system. So you eliminate toxins from your brain and they drain through that system. Now, this is an interesting bit, that at night, when you go to sleep, well, assuming that it's night you go to sleep, anyway, when you go to sleep, I've got to catch myself there. So when you sleep, your brain cells, there's certain cells, glial cells, that actually then get smaller, and it opens up those channels, and those channels are 10 times larger when you're asleep than when you're awake. See, sleep time is a critical time where your brain, it does many things. I mean, you know, you can consolidate memories, you know, you process information of what happened the previous day, but you also detox your brain during sleep time. So, glymphatic system, it's a fascinating thing. And this is why it's interesting, you know, some people, you know, do you remember like in the old days, maybe there's some people even now, there are politicians and others who pride themselves, hey, look, we cope, we do 4 hours sleep a night. Well, you know what, there's some famous names that you follow them, and they might have been in the 80s and 90s, but look at them now, and look, there's a number I know, they ended up getting dementia. And that's the point. You want to make sure that you get the quality sleep to be able to drain toxicity, so the glymphatic system. So sleep is very important as far as the detox process. Sunlight, we've mentioned sunlight. I don't want to go too much more into it, but a little bit of sunlight can be good. And even if you are outside in the shade, but your eyes are exposed to sunlight, it can help set the body clock. Yeah, so even there. So right now, as you know, I look out there, there's some sunshine. You know what, if you go out in the sun, ideally the morning sun is good because it helps to set the body clock. Okay, sweat. Now that's an interesting one, because we've talked a lot about, you know, the kidneys and the liver, but what about sweating? You know, there's some people who say they can't sweat much. Now, the point is they probably haven't done it for a while, and they've maybe sometimes even built up a toxic load. But being able to sweat is very good at eliminating toxins, and it actually takes the load off your kidneys as well. One of the ways, now, sometimes saunas can be very effective, and there's some households that you get a far infrared sauna. I don't know if anyone's heard of one of those, far infrared sauna. It's a kind of a large box. You can actually put it, you know, at the back of your house, or some people, and even units, will put them in their unit. And it doesn't go up to, you know, 90 and 100 degrees like the traditional saunas. It might go up to 50 or 60 degrees. But it penetrates, the infrared rays, they penetrate, and they you get a deep sweat. And so it might take a little while until you become used to it. The first time or two takes a while. But after that, you very quickly break out into a copious sweat. They use this, there are a couple of examples. The firefighters who were, you know, in was it 2000, a long time ago now, you know, the Trade Centre. There were some of the firefighters, because firefighters are exposed to all sorts of toxins, right? So the firefighters, a lot of them got very ill health. But there was one group, they went through a sauna detox program, and they tested the various, you know, blood and urine analysis. Their toxic levels went down much faster, and they got their health back much faster than those who didn't go through the program. Similar, there was, many years ago, there was a mining disaster in Chile, the country of Chile, where the miners were trapped underground. A lot of them had toxicity after that. There was a group that went through a sauna detox program. Same thing. They measured the various toxic levels. They fell much quicker, and what's more, they regained their health much faster. So for some people, a sauna, now if you want to go into that, look, you know, depending on, you know, the health circumstances, you know, go and talk to someone who, you know, is experienced in the area, but it's something well worth considering if someone wants to, you know, has a toxicity issue and wants to be able to detox. It's a very helpful adjunct. The next one's fasting. Fasting's something not many people want to think about. Most people don't want to go without food. But you know what? Even something like intermittent fasting is good, where you might have a break of 16 to 18 hours. And we know that reboosts, we spoke, I think, about it briefly yesterday. It can help with the gut microbiome. But the point is that what happens when you're not having more food come in, your body starts prioritising components. After it's about 17 or 18 hours, the weaker cells go into what's called apoptosis. They can self-destruct because they're weak and unviable, so it helps to strengthen things. The other thing is, look, and here, if you do a longer fast, you need to get, you know, medical advice and appropriate, you know, supervision at times. But look, there are studies done. Victor Longo, who was at University of Southern California, he's in a longevity research institute, but he's looking at this, and he found out that, look, 3 days of water-only fasting helps to, it resets, it rejuvenates our immune system and our stem. We get a reboot of our stem cells. It can actually do a lot of good things with your white cells and just your immune system generally. And some people, the funny thing is, he was asked one time, he was interviewed and he was asked, look, if you were diagnosed with cancer, what would you do? He said the first thing he would do would go on a 7-day water-only fast. Now, I'm not saying that that's what everyone should do. I'm just quoting him as being someone who says, well, look, that's something, because what it does, there's no question that then you get breakdown of weak components, you get cell death, and it certainly will put, weaker cells under stress. What we do know is that then the contents of those cells are released and the toxins need to be processed. Now, this is why it needs to be done under medical supervision. Because you can get very sick if you've got a big toxic load if you suddenly dump a lot of toxins. So you need to have the pathways of detoxing open. You need to make sure the liver is working well, the bile, the bowels, the kidneys, all of that has to be working well. Because otherwise you're just going to feel dreadful and you're just going to recirculate them and they'll deposit somewhere else. But here's the thing, but you need to have medical supervision because there's electrolytes, okay, things like sodium, potassium, okay, magnesium, bicarbonate. I mean, these things ideally need to be balanced, so that you've got to be aware of those. And the thing is, there are certain other, say, supplements that are sometimes useful and helpful in that process. That's why you want to be guided by someone who is knowledgeable in the area. The other risk, if you detox too quickly, and if you lose too much weight too quickly by going on a water-only fast, you risk the toxins accumulating, you risk the bile becoming sludgy, and you risk gallstones, and you risk ending up with acute cholecystitis, and you could end up in hospital having to get your gallbladder taken out. Okay, so so what I'm saying is fasting can be very powerful when it comes to detoxing, but if you're interested in going down that pathway, make sure that you research it well and you get advice from people who are knowledgeable in the area. Supplements, we could talk a lot about supplements. I guess I won't, just to say, look, they do have their place. Look, I'm a bit suspicious. You can go to the chemist and get a 10-day detox kit, right? Okay. Look, I'm not saying it's of no use, but I don't think it's of major use. What we're talking about here is a total lifestyle ongoing program. We know that we're exposed to toxicity all the time, but we know also then we need to develop and establish lifestyle practices that minimise toxins coming in on an ongoing basis, and at the same time we want to make sure that we have lifestyle measures that address toxicity and help to eliminate those toxins. So this is not a 10-day process. This is a process that is a lifestyle ongoing process, because unfortunately we're surrounded by those toxins and even on an increasing basis. Now, we want to manage our stress. We spoke a bit about that yesterday. In fact, we spoke a lot about that yesterday. So the funny thing is a lot of these principles will also help address stress as well. And positive emotions. So positive emotions are much better than negative emotions, and we know that. We know that they're much good for health. So as the good book says, a cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. This is another one in Philippians chapter 4. It says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." I mean, what excellent, also empowering advice. Because when we think about these things, well, guess what? We're going to feel a lot better. And I think that's a good thing. And this operates, and the good book operates within the context that God is love. And if indeed there is such a God who exists, and I believe there is, then you know what? It makes sense that having a positive lifestyle, positive emotions, actually looking after the bodies that He has made, you know what? They work better when we follow good principles that follow good medical science, what we're finding. So we've covered a lot of material, haven't we? So the question is, detox, what is it and does it work? Well, I think we've looked at that. I think it's an important thing because of the toxicity that we're surrounded with. Does it work? Look, I've shared some stories of things that certainly have worked, but what is very clear that on a population basis, if we can approach this, we're going to have a much healthier population if we look at the principles of looking after our bodies and making sure we don't put the toxins in, but if we do, we've got good mechanisms by which we can address toxicity. So, I wish everybody here good health, and look, I think it'd be nice to wrap up. So look, thank you so much. I've enjoyed the series. We've had last night, we had this morning, we had this afternoon. We've covered a lot of material, so hopefully there's been some good tips that you can implement, because if you do, look, I think there's a very good chance that you're going to feel better, you're going to address, you're going to prevent diseases, you're going to address lifestyle diseases, and hopefully you'll add a good many years to your life as well. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So, well, thank you so much. And Barb, perhaps if I'll pass the microphone over you to say some concluding words if you'd like.
Oh, wasn't that so interesting? Yeah, absolutely.